I am Elena. This is my company, and this is my confession. Not of a crime, but of a harvest. Mark announced that I was a thief. That was the first sentence he uttered in the emergency board meeting he had called. The words hung in the sterile air of the conference room. He was standing, leaning forward on his knuckles, his face a mask of performative rage and betrayal. He had staged this perfectly. The two other board members, Harrison and Chen, looked stunned. Our legal counsel, Mary. I just looked down at her notepad. Mark, my business partner of 15 years, slammed a printed bank statement onto the polished mahogany table. He announced to the room that he had caught me. He said he knew something was wrong, that our margins were too tight, and he had found this. He pointed a thick finger at the paper. $500,000. Wired last Tuesday to an unknown shell corporation in Delaware. An account, he claimed, that was controlled by me. This was his moment. He expected me to shatter. He expected tears. Disperate denials. Perhaps an attempt to bargain. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a true narcissist, that I was stupid, that I was weak, and that I had been caught. He thought he was brilliant for finding the transfer, for finally cornering the quiet, competent woman who had actually built the company. My hands did not shake. My voice did not waver. My internal monologue was perfectly calm. It was not the sound of panic. It was the sound of a very old, very heavy steel door finally locking into place. A feeling not of fear, but of profound relief. The wait was over. He had actually done it. After all these years of quiet theft and credit stealing, he had finally become arrogant enough to try and frame me, and he was using the very trap I had set for him as his evidence. He was still talking, his voice rising in manufactured outrage. He claimed I had been bleeding them dry while he was out, bringing in clients. He demanded my immediate removal. He demanded a vote. Now, I looked up from the paper and met his gaze. My face was neutral. I gave him nothing. No fear. No anger. Just a cold, blank assessment. I remembered, for a fleeting second, a different man. 10 years ago, we were in our first tiny office, drinking cheap champagne from plastic cups. He had slung his arm around me, calling me his work wife. His partner. He had smiled. A real smile back then, and said we were in it together. Now, I looked at the man in the expensive, ill-fitting suit. That partner was long gone, replaced by a parasite, a man who believed his own press, convinced that his charm was a substitute for the work I did every single night. His fatal miscalculation was not in thinking I would steal. It was in thinking that I thought like him. It was in believing, truly believing, that I was not smarter than he was. Harrison, one of the board members, finally spoke, his voice hesitant. He asked if I had anything to say. Mark smiled, leaning back. He crossed his arms. This was it. The kill. I let the silence stretch. I watched the confidence in his eyes. Then, I slowly turned my head. I did not address Mark. I looked directly at Mary, or legal counsel. I asked her, my voice low and steady, to please display Section 4, Subsection B, of the founding operating agreement for the board. Mark's smile faltered. He had no idea what Section 4, Subsection B was. He had not read it 15 years ago, and he had not read it since. I had. I wrote it. Mary, the legal counsel, looked up, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. She typed for a moment on her laptop. The large monitor on the wall, the one Mark had intended to use to display my humiliation, flickered to life. It displayed a wall of text, page 72 of our founding agreement. Mark squinted at it, his face contorting in confusion. He asked what this was. what Section 4 was. I quietly asked Mary to please read subsection B. Mary cleared her throat and began to read. Her voice was flat. A simple recitation of facts. She read that Section 4, subsection B, was the emergency escrow clause. It stated that in the event one partner possessed a good faith suspicion of imminent, severe financial misconduct by another partner, said first, partner was granted unilateral authority. They could transfer endangered capital into a protected third-party escrow account, pending a full board review. The room was silent. Mark, however, finally understood the words. He just could not comprehend the logic. He snarled, insisting he never signed that I must have faked it. I watched him. I remembered the day we signed this agreement. 15 years ago. Mark was wearing his golf shirt, angry because the legal review was making him late for his tea time. He had not read a single page. He had scribbled his signature while complaining about the traffic. I remembered his exact words. He had laughed and told me he trusted me, to just tell him where to sign. He had not trusted me. He had just been lazy. He was so consumed with his own importance that he considered the actual rules of his own company to be beneath him. Now, that detail was his executioner. Mary calmly clicked again. The final, signed page appeared on the screen. His sloppy signature next to mine. He spat that this was ridiculous. He yelled that I still stole the money, that I admitted I moved it. I finally spoke. I confirmed that I did move the $500,000, as was my right under Section 4. Subsection B. I explained that the clause, as Mary just read, required suspicion of imminent, severe financial misconduct to be activated. It also required that the partner present their evidence to the board at the earliest possible opportunity. I paused. I looked at him. I thanked him for providing that opportunity. I nodded to Mary. She clicked again. The screen changed. It was no longer a legal document. It was an email, from Mark, to an entity named Aperture Holdings LLC. Harrison asked what this was. I explained that was the imminent, severe financial misconduct. I stated that Mark had just accused me of transferring $500,000 to protect the company. What he had failed to mention was why I had to. The next slide appeared, and the next, forged invoices, emails from Mark to Aperture Holdings, which was, of course, his Delaware shell company, a detailed plan to siphon not $500,000, but $3 million from our operating budget. He was going to gut the company and leave me holding the bag. Mark was no longer yelling. He was silent. He was white as a sheet, his mouth open. Finally understanding, he had walked into a trap and triggered it himself. The evidence he had found was the very evidence I had created. The transfer I had made, knowing it was the only way to activate the clause. Harrison looked at Mark. His face filled with a cold fury. He asked Mark if it was true. Mark said nothing. Harrison said he called for a vote. Not to expel me. He called for an immediate, indefinite suspension of Mark, pending a full, forensic audit. Chen seconded it. 3 hands went up. Mine, Harrison's, Chen's. Mark finally collapsed into his chair. He looked small. I looked at Mary. My voice still perfectly even. I asked her to please call security. I informed her that Mark's access was suspended, and he needed to be escorted from the building. The meeting was over. The board members, Harrison and Chen, left the room quickly, eager to distance themselves from the explosion. They were cowards, but useful ones. I did not stay to celebrate. I walked calmly from the conference room, down the hall, and took the elevator to the 17th floor, to the server room. Our head of IT, a man named Ben, was waiting for me. He looked nervous. I told him he had heard correctly. I stated that Mark's employment was suspended. effective immediately. His network access, his building access, his email, every single point of entry. I wanted it all severed. Now. Ben just nodded and sat at his terminal. I stood beside him, watching. As Ben typed. I pictured Mark. I imagined him storming through the lobby, getting into his company-leased car. He would be sitting in the parking garage, fuming. He would pull up to the exit gate. He would swipe the sleek, black corporate credit card he used for everything, and the machine would inform him the card was declined. I knew this because, as I stood next to Ben, I was also on my own laptop, logged into the master banking portal. Mark was a parasite for 15 years, and he had lived entirely off the corporate body. He had no personal liquidity because he never needed it. He believed the company's money was his money. I clicked deactivate. I did the same for his 2 other corporate cards. My laptop screen flashed an alert. A failed login attempt. He was in his car, in that garage, frantically trying to log into the company bank accounts from his phone. He was a cornered animal, and he was stupidly predictable. But the password he was typing was already gone. I had changed it that morning. He was locked out. The forensic audit was now just a formality. The auditors would find exactly what I wanted them to find. His fatal miscalculation was in forgetting who had built the cage. I closed my laptop. The first domino had fallen. Mark was not just unemployed. He was penniless, locked out, and stranded in his own parking garage. I was back in my own office. It was quiet. My desk phone chimed. It was an internal transfer from Mary, the legal counsel. She told me Mark was on her other line. She said he was agitated. She thought I should be aware of the conversation. As acting CEO, I told her to put him on speaker. I would listen. I told her not to tell him I was there. There was a click, and then the sound of Mark's voice, distorted by a cheap cell signal and pure, undiluted rage. He was screaming. He was threatening to sue Mary, to sue the entire board. He yelled that Harrison and Chen were dead, and he promised he would have me in prison by tonight. I leaned back in my chair. When the money failed, he turned to force. He was trying to weaponize the system. His fatal miscalculation was that he thought the company's lawyer was his lawyer. He had always treated Mary, a brilliant legal mind, as his personal concierge. He saw her, and the entire legal budget. As a perk of his position, he was still roaring that he was the company. I heard Mary's voice, cold as steel. She informed him that she did not work for him. She worked for the company. There was a long, stunned silence on the line. I could hear his breathing. Mary continued. She stated that as of 1 hour ago, he was a suspended employee pending a forensic investigation. The company was now under the sole direction of Elena. She informed him that her duty was to the company, and the company, via me, had instructed her to cooperate fully with the forensic auditors. That included providing them with all evidence of his external activities, such as Aperture Holdings. The sound he made was almost a choke. He was finally understanding. The lawyer he thought was his bulldog was now the state's witness. Mary advised him to retain his own counsel. She then advised him to never contact her again, as any further communication would be seen as an attempt to interfere with a corporate investigation. She hung up on him. "Un moment later." My own line chimed. It was Mary again. She just said he was neutralized. I replied, "Yes." I thanked her for her clarity and asked her to send me the final draft of the board minutes. I hung up. He had forgotten the most important rule of all: the entity is all that matters. And I was the only one left who spoke for it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. At 9 a.m., the forensic auditors arrived. They were not the company's usual accountants, the ones Mark played golf with. These were 2 men and a woman from a specialized firm in Washington, D.C. They were sharp, and had the calm aura of people who stared at financial crimes all day. I met them in the main conference room, the same room where Mark had imploded. I gave them the signed board resolution authorizing their engagement, and the evidence I had presented. The lead auditor picked up the printouts of Mark's emails. She scanned them. She noted, Aperture Holdings LLC, Delaware. Standard. My internal monologue was almost amused. Mark truly thought he was a mastermind. He had created a shell company, but his fatal miscalculation was his complete lack of originality. He did not realize that a Delaware LLC was also pathetically easy to trace under a formal audit. He had built his secret treasure chest in the most obvious, well-lit place in the world. I gave them full authority. I told them to contact the bank in Delaware. I went back to my office. At 2:15 p.m., I received an email. It was from the bank in Delaware. It was a courtesy notification, informing me as the company's acting CEO that the Aperture Holdings account had been placed under an immediate, indefinite administrative freeze due to a formal fraud inquiry. The domino had fallen. I pictured Mark. His last, desperate hope would have been that shell account. The $3 million he had already started to move. He would have been on his laptop all morning, frantically trying to transfer that money to another account. But he was too late. He had no idea how fast the system moves when it is protecting itself. He thought he had weeks. He did not realize that the moment he called that meeting, he started a clock. And he was not the one holding the stopwatch. He was now, officially, broke. The money he had already stolen was trapped, and the money he planned to steal was gone. My day continued. On my desk sat Mark's company phone. Security had retrieved it from his desk. It was company property. And as acting CEO, I had a duty to review his communications. As I worked, the dark screen suddenly lit up. It was a notification. Mark was using his personal cell, trying to reach Harrison's personal cell. He was in the next phase of his panic. His money was frozen. His lawyers had abandoned him. His shell company was locked. The only thing Mark had left was his network, his boys' club, his golf buddies. I leaned back, watching the dark screen. I remembered a dinner. About a year ago, a lavish steakhouse. Mark had been holding court, bourbon in his hand, laughing. He was boasting about Harrison and Chen. He had called them his puppets. He said they were weak fools who would do anything for him as long as he kept the stock price high. He truly believed that. He believed the sycophants he had surrounded himself with were his friends. He believed their loyalty was to him. That was his fatal miscalculation. These men were not friends. They were fellow parasites. And they could smell a dying host. The call alert on Mark's phone went dark. Harrison had not answered. A few seconds later, my desk phone rang. My personal, private line. I looked at the caller ID. It was Harrison. I let it ring twice. Then I picked it up. His voice was oily Juana del Dead, slick with a desperate, newfound respect. He told me he was appalled. Just appalled. He said what Mark did, what he tried to do to me, was unconscionable. I said nothing. I just listened. It continued. Babbling now. He wanted me to know that I had his 100% complete support. Whatever I and the auditors needed. Anything. He said we were with me. We were going to clean this house. His voice was dripping with fear. He was not calling to support me. He was calling to save himself. He was terrified that the audit would find his complicity, his lazy oversight. He was calling to pledge allegiance to the new queen, hoping she would not investigate him. I thanked him for his support of the audit. I told him I had to go. I hung up on him. My phone rang again. It was Chen. I looked at Mark's dead company phone on my desk. He was a social leper. His parasitic power was gone. The well had just informed him that he was the poison. I let Chen's call go to voicemail. I spent the next 2 days in a blur of focused work. I met with the department heads, stabilized the accounts, and spoke with our largest clients. I assured them that the company's leadership was secure. On the 3rd day, the next domino fell. My new head of communications, a sharp woman I had promoted, walked into my office. She looked pale. She told me we had a problem. A big one. David Geller had just called her. David Geller, a slimy, bottom-feeding industry blogger who traded in rumors. A man Mark would feed scoops to overexpensive lunches. She explained that Geller was running a story. He was claiming Mark was his source. And the story was that Mark had discovered my fraud, that I was the one with the shell company. He was claiming that when Mark tried to confront me, I staged a hostile coup and had him illegally ousted. Geller was painting Mark as the victim. As a whistleblower, this was the last, desperate act of a cornered coward. He was broke. He was alone. His only remaining weapon was his own hypocrisy. He was trying to create a public crisis. My communications head was panicking, asking if she should deny it or issue a new comment. Geller was running the story in an hour. I looked out the window. Mark thought he was starting a new fire. But he had, once again, forgotten the details. I turned back to my comms director. I told her she would not deny anything. I told her to call Mr. Becken. Gellerbeck. She would thank him for his journalistic diligence, and she would tell him that, to ensure his story was 100% accurate, we were happy to provide him with the official source material. She looked confused. She asked what source material. I opened my laptop, clicked on the file Mary had sent me 2 days prior, and attached it to a new email. I told her to send him this, and only this. She asked what it was. I explained it was the finalized, signed, and legally binding minutes from the board meeting on Tuesday. The minutes that Mr. Playsecken, Geller's whistleblower, seemed to have forgotten about. The ones that detailed, in very dry, legal language, the evidence of Mark's fraud via Aperture Holdings and the board's unanimous vote to suspend him. Her eyes went wide. I smiled. A thin, cold smile. I told her the truth was already on the record. Mark had not just leaked his story. He had, in his final, idiotic act of arrogance, just ensured that the truth of his disgrace was about to become very, very public. An hour later, David Geller's story went live. It was exactly what I expected. It was a journalistic execution. The headline was brutal. It described Mark's failed attempt to frame me, followed by the devastating, factual counterpunch. Geller had published excerpts from the board minutes. He coded Section 4, Subsection B. He named Aperture Holdings LLC. Mark's disparity. Hypocritical lie had backfired completely, serving only to make the truth explosive. I closed the browser tab. The following morning, I was drinking my coffee when a new alert flashed on my screen. It was a market notification. Our company stock, which had been stable for years, was in free fall. It had opened down 30%. The blog story had gone viral. The public, undeniable proof of a founder's fraud had terrified the market. My internal monologue remained calm. This was collateral damage. But it was predictable. The stock would recover once the market saw that the cancer had been removed. But then I thought about Mark, and I smiled. Mark did not just own stock. He was his stock. His entire, lavish, parasitic life was built on it. I knew, because I had seen the loan applications, that he had not bought his sprawling mansion. He had leveraged it. He had used his millions in company shares as collateral for a massive loan. He had done the same for his collection of sports cars, the same for his art. His fatal miscalculation was a classic piece of narcissistic finance. He believed the stock's value was a permanent reflection of his genius. He believed it would never go down. And the story, the public fallout from the trap I had set, was the gust of wind that had just blown it all down. With the stock down 30%, his shares were no longer worth enough to cover his loans. I pictured him, in whatever cheap motel he was staying in. His corporate cards dead. His shell account frozen. He would be looking at the stock ticker in pure, animalistic terror. And then, his personal phone would ring. It would be his private banker. The banker's voice would not be friendly. It would be cold. The banker would be making a margin call. He would be informing Mark that he had 24 hours to deposit millions of dollars in new capital to cover his losses. Millions he did not have. Millions that were, at that very moment, frozen by the auditors I had unleashed. If he failed, the bank would seize everything. The house, the cars. I had only ever planned to destroy his professional life. His own arrogance was so absolute that it was destroying his personal one. I did not even have to lift a finger. It took another week. A quiet, brutal week. The news of Mark's margin calls and the seizure of his assets had become public knowledge. He had, as I predicted, lost everything. He was financially vaporized. Then, on a Friday afternoon, the auditors requested a final meeting. It was just me, Harrison, and Chen. We sat in the same boardroom. The lead auditor opened a thick, 3-ring binder. "Our forensic audit is complete," she said. Harrison, his hands visibly shaking, reached for it. The stock crash had hit his portfolio. Too, he was terrified. The auditor explained that the initial evidence of a $3 million diversion was correct. However, that was only the most recent plan. She said they uncovered a systemic, 7-year pattern of fraudulent invoicing, kickbacks, and direct embezzlement. The total, she said, was just over $12 million. Chen made a small, strangled sound. This was more. Even I had not known the full extent. The auditor continued. She stated that the blog story and the stock drop had, as they knew, triggered several shareholder inquiries. She informed them that 3 separate class action lawsuits were being prepared against the board, against them, for gross negligence. This was the final domino. Harrison and Chen were now in the trap. The public nature of the scandal meant they could not just sweep this under the rug. If they did, they would be named as co-conspirators. They were trapped. Their own cowardly, passive oversight had finally come due. Harrison looked at me. His eyes were desperate. He was looking for me to save him. I said nothing. I just waited. I was not his savior. He understood. He pounded his fist on the table. Performing for the record. He declared this was criminal. An outrage. He said Mark Davis had done this to their company. My internal monologue was pure ice. Their company, the company he had ignored. Harrison announced that they must act. He demanded they turn this entire audit, every single page, over to the district attorney's office. Immediately. Chen nodded vigorously. I watched them, 2 rats, jumping from a sinking ship they had helped scuttle, frantically trying to look like captains. They believed they were doing this to seek justice. But I knew the truth. They were just saving themselves. They were sacrificing Mark to the wolves to save their own worthless skins. It did not matter. The result was the same. I said that I agreed. Mary, our lawyer, recorded the unanimous vote. The trap was now complete. It had not just removed Mark. It had not just bankrupted him. It had, with the cold, perfect logic of a system he had despised, just ensured his criminal destruction. He was no longer just a disgraced executive. He was a future inmate. 3 months later, I stood in the corner office on the 40th floor. My office. It had, of course, been Mark's. When I first walked in here after the board had formally elected me CEO, The room had been a monument to his ego. The walls were a dark, suffocating mahogany. A massive, gaudy chandelier hung too low. The shelves were not filled with books, but with meaningless deal trophies. Lucite blocks celebrating acquisitions that I had structured and he had taken credit for. Now, the room was unrecognizable. I had the walls painted a clean, bright white. The heavy drapes were gone. The only furniture was my own minimalist standing desk and a small conference table. There were no trophies, just whiteboards, covered in strategic plans. The room was no longer a shrine to an ego. It was a tool for work. I was at my desk, finishing the last task of the day. It was a simple wire transfer approval. The final payment to the forensic auditors. The file was now closed. I clicked approve. I looked up at the wall opposite my desk. There was only one thing hanging there. It was not a painting. It was a simple, black frame. Inside it was a single, laminated piece of paper. Page 72 of the Founding Operating Agreement. Section 4. Subsection B. The Emergency Escrow Clause. It was my only trophy. I thought about Mark. He was awaiting trial. He was bankrupt. His wife had left him. His friends, Harrison and Chen, were still on the board. For now, they were quiet, terrified, and did exactly as I told them. The destruction was total, financial, social, criminal. Mark's fatal miscalculation was so simple. He always said he was a big-picture person. He used to say it with such pride, such condescension. He would wave his hand dismissively in meetings where I was trying to discuss legal exposure or financial controls. He would laugh and tell me not to get bogged down in the details. He would say that was what he paid me for. He was a rainmaker. He saw the vision. I looked at the framed page. His vision, his big picture. It was all built on a foundation of laziness, arrogance, and a complete, contemptuous disregard for the very rules that held his world together. He never understood. He thought the details were a prison for me. He never realized that the details were the bars of his